If you are in one of the overflow theaters right now, you can come to the main theater. There's plenty of room in here, and I'd like to see, well, I can't really see you because of the light, but it'd make me feel better if we were completely filled up in here. So. Okay. Let's get started then. My name is Shawn Price, and we're here to talk about healthcare startups and why they're hard. If that doesn't interest you, you should probably find a different theater because you're going to be bored for the next 60 minutes. So before I get started, I'm curious who I'm talking to here. I'm going to have you show your hands, and then I'm going to do this so that I can see actually. If you work in healthcare IT right now, could you raise your hand? Oh, good. There's going to be a lot of preaching to the choir going on here. Perfect. If you work for a company that you would call a healthcare startup, raise your hand. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to define startup for you, but I will say if you've had a $1 billion exit within the last 18 months, you probably don't count anymore. So, let's see that again. Okay, a couple hands went down. Perfect. So if you have an interest in starting a healthcare startup on your own or going to join one in the next couple years, could I see a show of hands? Okay, perfect. And is there anybody in here who's sitting next to their current boss so they couldn't honestly answer that previous question? Yeah, okay, perfect. I didn't expect anything different. So who am I? Like I said, my name is Shawn Price. I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders of a company called Healthy Roster. And what we do is we build outreach tools for healthcare providers with a specialty really in sports medicine right now. I didn't always come from healthcare. In fact, I kind of stumbled into it relatively recently on the scale of my career. I was in consulting for a long time, a lot of different industries. None of them were healthcare. I got recruited out of that to work for a company called Digital Scout, and we did live streaming of high school sports. That company got bought. That's actually where I met my co-founders, by the way. That company got bought by a company out of Atlanta, kind of a content roll-up play. So we knew we weren't going to be there much longer. It was kind of not where we were going to live for a long time. So we were trying to identify what our next opportunity was. We knew the youth sports field because that's what we had been doing for a long time. So we were trying to find something in that. And we knew concussions were a hot topic then, just as they still are right now. So we came up with the idea of an injury management and communication platform for coaches and parents. It seemed like a really good idea at the time. I'm glad that wasn't our final idea because there's hundreds of those and none of them make any money. But that's what we started out with. And we realized pretty early on that we weren't going to be able to make any money. Number one, youth leagues are notoriously difficult to sell to, and parents don't want to shell out money until something's already gone wrong. So we had to find some way to monetize this platform. So we started talking to athletic trainers who are the medical providers on the sideline at these sporting events. And their boss is typically the sports medicine director at a local healthcare provider. So we started talking to those sports medicine directors because they're the ones that might actually have some money in this ecosystem. And we were talking about sponsorship opportunities, some ways that we could partner. And brainstorming, we threw out the idea of a virtual athletic trainer, kind of a remote resource where parents could reach out on demand and ask a question like, hey, Johnny has a headache. Do we need to go to the ER? Does he have a concussion? What about this sprained ankle? What do we do there? So that actually struck a chord with sports medicine directors, and they said, hey, we'll actually pay for that. So great, now we have a product, right? We didn't really have a product before until somebody said they'd pay for it. So that's great news. Finding somebody that's willing to pay for your product is something 9 out of 10 startups don't actually find. The bad news is suddenly we're no longer a youth sports play where we actually knew the field. Now we're in healthcare where none of us know what the heck we're doing, and none of us have any experience with it. So there's a huge learning curve that we have to overcome. I'm glad to say that 3 years later, I feel like we have overcome that. We've made a lot of progress. We have over 100 customers, different healthcare providers right now, in like 30 some odd states across the nation. So things have gone well, but it's been a long road and a lot of mistakes made along the way. So my goal with this talk is to kind of short circuit that for you and kind of give you a shortcut to get from where we were when we started, maybe not all the way to where we are right now, but kind of point you in the right direction. So why is healthcare so hard? There's a lot of different reasons. I think one of the primary reasons is because in IT in general, we're very spoiled right now. I mean, you may not feel spoiled, but you are. When it comes to access of information and finding answers to your questions, there's so much available with just a Google search right now. How many of you are developers in here? Can I see raise of hands? Okay, yeah, how many of you that are developers, this is what your day-to-day job looks like for like 50% of the day, right? You don't have to do critical thought anymore. You do a Google search, you copy and paste it. And the best part is, the answer's already been vetted by hundreds of other pedantic developers that are going to tell you every edge case for you. So you don't have to think about that, right? We're very spoiled with Stack Overflow and other online resources right now. Even open source communities where documentation is notoriously horrible, there's usually a community around it, right, that will answer your questions. Problem is in healthcare IT, that's not always easily available. If you work for a healthcare IT company, which it sounds like most of you do, which is great, because you have resources around you that will help you learn these things. If you're coming in fresh, it's a long way to go, and it's hard to find these online resources. And a lot of the times you end up having to pay for online classes, which is super frustrating, because most of the time those classes are put on by vendors, and they're really sales pitches masquerading as a educational opportunity, like they're selling you a condo in Florida kind of situation. But in healthcare, they have the audacity to not only give you the sales pitch, but then they charge you for the sales pitch. So it's super frustrating. Why else is healthcare hard? Well, even after you feel like you've learned something at one healthcare provider, taking it to the next one doesn't necessarily mean it translates. There's kind of an old joke around integrations in healthcare that once you've done one integration, you've done one integration, right? Because they're all different. Everybody operates with a different workflow. Nobody operates the exact same way. And you talk about jargon. I don't know how many times we've come into one healthcare system and they've corrected us on our terminology, only to find out they're the only people that call it that. So you learn something in one healthcare provider, then you go down the street and you try to apply it somewhere else. It's just so fragmented, sometimes it doesn't even translate. At larger healthcare providers, you don't even have to go down the street sometimes. You just have to go 2 hallways over, and they don't know what the heck the other group is doing. We've been on multiple calls with IT people and people like the COO of a healthcare system, and we've had to explain to them how sports medicine works. It's just, what your niche is, and you figure that out, and you don't need to know everything else. The clinician over here doesn't need to know how they work 2 hallways over. They just need to know how their hallway works, right? Well, in IT, you don't have that luxury because you're building solutions for everybody. So that's another reason why it's difficult. One of the resources that I found most valuable in kind of solving this problem and kind of giving context to the healthcare IT issue is this Hacking Healthcare book. It's a little bit dated at this point, but it's not a resource manual or a how-to, which is actually what I was looking for when I found this resource. So it actually aged pretty well. Really what it does well is it gives you a context around why certain things are difficult or why certain things are the way they are in healthcare. So you may come in thinking, oh, scheduling is not hard. Well, this book does a great job of explaining why scheduling in healthcare is such a difficult task, and payments and all of those kind of things. So it's actually a really great resource. You'll get way more out of this book than you will this talk, which is fair because I only have an hour. But definitely check that out. I made my whole team read it, and I don't know if they appreciate it or not, but I appreciate not having to reiterate everything that was in the book. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up this topic as to why healthcare is difficult. HIPAA compliance is something that keeps a lot of people out of moving into the healthcare field because they're afraid of it. And it's this big, scary idea that they don't really understand. And if you're coming in fresh, it makes perfect sense why it's scary. I mean, it was scary to me coming in. I didn't know how to be HIPAA compliant and what was involved in that. And with slogans like this, it's not a suggestion, it's the law, right? That's a little aggressive, but there's truth to it. It's not a suggestion, it is the law. You can't just pay lip service to it, but it's also completely manageable. So don't let that scare you if you are outside of the healthcare industry right now, or if you're working at a big company and it's not something you have to worry about day to day. Don't let that scare you from starting your own healthcare startup because you can manage it. It's getting easier all the time as well. So let's back up a little bit and talk about how we got to where we are. And we can start with HIPAA, like we were just talking about. So HIPAA originally was passed in 1996. It's been modified over the years. Things have been added on. More recently, they came up with the Omnibus bill, which was kind of a combination of all the things that have changed over the years and kind of gives clarity to a lot of different things. But HIPAA in general provides some framework for you to work with. So the first thing you need to know is what a covered entity is. Most of you that are in here in healthcare, I'm sure you know what a covered entity is. It's a healthcare provider, it's a insurance plan provider, it's somebody that handles payments for them, clearinghouse. If you are a covered entity, you know what a covered entity is. Most startups are not covered entities. Most startups will fall into the secondary category, which is a business associate. And essentially, a business associate is someone that processes data, PHI specifically, which is protected health information. If you don't know that term, it's analogous to like PII and PCI compliance. It's health information about status, care, condition, payment, any of those kind of things. Coverage, those are all considered PHI. So if you process that data on behalf of a covered entity, which is typically a healthcare provider or insurer or something, you are considered a business associate. There are practical applications of that. Originally, HIPAA really only applied to covered entities, and it created a loophole where you could kind of outsource everything over to a business associate. Later on, they amended it so that now business associates are now required to follow and be in compliance with HIPAA as well. Something else to keep in mind is HIPAA is non-prescriptive, which means they don't tell you how to solve the problems, they just tell you what problems need solving, the things that you need to address. So they don't tell you, oh, this is the exact encryption algorithm that you need to use, and this is the key strength that you need to use. No, they just say you really need to have encryption, and then they leave it up to you on how you implement it. Now, certain healthcare providers might have standards around that. When they do a security assessment and review of you, they may say you have to have this level of standard, but the HIPAA, the laws do not go into that much detail. It's a much higher level non-prescriptive way of looking at it. Like I said, it covers both business entities and covered entities, or business associates and covered entities. It also has two real sides to it. One is the technical requirements around the solution that you're building, and the other half of it, and this is honestly the harder part of it, is the governance and compliance of your organization. It's not enough to just build a HIPAA-compliant solution, especially if you're operating as kind of like a SaaS vendor. If you're processing the data and you're handling the data, you have to have a lot of compliance obligations that you have to adhere to in order to be HIPAA compliant. There is no official HIPAA certification. There are a couple things that are kind of viewed as fairly official, but it's nothing from there's no stamp of approval from the government saying you are HIPAA compliant. They do fine people for not being HIPAA compliant. For the most part, it's usually triggered by some sort of action, like, hey, there was a data breach, or somebody lost a laptop, and turns out you're being negligent or careless. It's very rare that they come in and audit you, although they're starting to do that more, I guess. I don't think they're doing that a whole lot with business associates, primarily with covered entities, but when they audit a covered entity, they also look at all the business associates that that covered entity works with. Usually the fines really add up when there's some sort of malicious intent or negligence involved. But you can be fined just for not complying as well. The last thing to keep in mind is, like I said earlier, it is completely manageable and not something that has to be so scary. And we'll dive a little bit more into what you need to do at a lower level later on. So who are the players? Providers are healthcare providers. That makes sense, right? They're hospitals, health groups, primary care physicians, physical therapists. The athletic trainers are part of providers that we work with. That's anybody that's providing clinical care, really. The payers are the people that are paying for services. That's kind of self-explanatory, right? The problem is, in the United States, we have a very complicated payer system to where we have insurers, private, we have Medicare and Medicaid, which are public sources, and then we have private payer as well, where sometimes you just want a service and you're going to pay it out of pocket. And depending on what kind of service and what kind of procedures you're getting, different people might be covering different entities might be covering different pieces of that. So it creates a very convoluted mess around the whole reimbursement model. And it's one of the harder things in healthcare, really, to deal with. There are whole vendors that deal with just the payment processing part of it because it's difficult to get right. Which brings us to vendors, right? And that's everybody that kind of glues things together. It's Healthy Roster is a vendor. The EHR systems, which is an electronic health record, and we'll cover why those are so important later on. Scheduling, patient engagement, all those tools, those are all the vendors. So this is the dream, right? This is the scenario that we want to get to. And this is where healthcare is really moving. We've made a lot of progress over the years on this. We always want the patient to receive the best care. I think all the players in the market, from healthcare providers to payers to vendors, would all agree that's our goal, right? How important that is versus profit, yeah, it depends on the person. But we also want to make sure the patient has access to the data. That seems great at a high level, but when you actually look at the practical implications of that, a healthcare provider, the more access to their data that they provide, the more at risk they become. If you are giving a patient access to all of the doctor's notes, for instance, suddenly that doctor becomes very liable. It's one of the reasons why doctors are really hesitant to allow people to record their visits, right? You think, oh, that's great, then the patient could go back and review that later on, and a lot of doctors are like, wait, that's opening me up for liability. I might say something, then I'm on the record, and they can go back and say, this is what you said, you didn't mean this exactly. The same thing is true for the data in general, right? The more data and they're granted, the more exposure and risk they're at. So while that's great at a high level, there's kind of a motivation for the healthcare provider to push back on that. Same thing with patient being able to correct mistakes. There's nothing worse than like on a credit report having a negative item and it not being right, except for maybe having something wrong on your health record, right? You miss an allergy, that affects what you're prescribed, it could affect your care, it could cause somebody to die in the worst case scenario, right? So that's one of the goals. Providers should be able to share data for care coordination. You send somebody over to a different provider, you want to be able to send their patient chart over there, right? That's a goal. It's gotten a lot better recently. That was a major problem for a really long time. And there's a reason why it's gotten better, and we'll cover that next. But then we also want to freely share data. That's one of the goals, the long-term goals of the whole initiative that the healthcare industry is working on right now. Google's got a major project around that, and just kind of putting data in a format that it can be processed to improve care, right? Through machine learning, AI, or whatever buzzword you want to throw out there. This is what HITECH was really pushing towards. And this is the other half of HIPAA, so you'll see it referred to as HIPAA/HITECH. This is the HITECH was addressing this side of it. And what it did was it introduced incentives for healthcare providers to adopt EHRs, and that's the electronic health records I referenced earlier. Essentially, the whole program was, hey, at the beginning, we're going to pay you a lot of money if you adopt an EHR system. And then as we get closer and closer to a certain deadline, we're going to minimize how much we're willing to pay you in order to adopt the system that you can then use to reimburse your cost of adopting the system. At a certain point, deadline, it flips a switch, and now it's no longer an incentive, and now we're going to fine you if you're not using a compliant EHR. So the other half of HITECH was it introduced the concept of meaningful use. And meaningful use essentially created a set of criteria for something to qualify as an EHR, right? You look at the term electronic health record, technically that could be an Excel spreadsheet, right? That's not all that useful though if we're looking to go back to the dream we were talking about where we're sharing data freely, right? No, we have to have something that's much more useful than that and has a certain set of common features across all of them. So that's what HITECH did. It also gave HIPAA more teeth for enforcement. So let's go back to the practical applications of HIPAA. What does this mean for you if you're starting a startup? Well, number one, you have to have business associates agreements now. If you are processing data and you're a business associate, you have to sign an agreement with that covered entity. And the agreements are pretty boilerplate at this point. They're pretty standard. They say, hey, here's what you can do with the data, and here's what happens when the contract is terminated. That's really the extent of what business associate agreements cover. They're not that difficult to read and understand. And once you've seen one, generally you'll understand all the other ones. Sometimes people throw a clause in there. You might have to ask them to strike that if it doesn't work with your business model. But for the most part, it's pretty boilerplate, and that's not a problem. The other half of it is you have to adhere to a set of security policies and procedures. And this covers a lot of different things. It maps fairly closely to the kind of PCI compliance, if you've been in a PCI compliant environment, where there's lots of controls in place around handling of data and access to data, and who can view it and securing the data. All of those things have to be documented, and what needs to be documented and what policies need to be in place is defined by HIPAA. So I've talked to other companies before that have spent upwards of like 20 grand getting a lawyer to draft together their security policies and procedures. And when you're a cash-strapped startup, that's a lot of money going out the door. The good news is HHS provides a template on their website that actually covers everything you need. And it's written in pretty plain English. It's a huge document, but it allows you to go through and just kind of tweak things and it allows you to know that you're covering everything because it's provided by the organization that's in charge of enforcing this, right? So that's a great source to have. This is what we did. I downloaded the template. I went through. I modified some things. I made some changes. I deleted a couple things I didn't think we needed. Turns out we did later on when we had a gap analysis. They had to add those back in, and I was like, okay, whatever. But I would suggest doing that. If you're starting your own startup, don't pay a lawyer $20,000, at least right off the bat. It's overkill. From a technical standpoint, there are some technical requirements that this spells out as well. The first and foremost one that you hear about all the time is data encryption in transit and at rest. That just means once you've written data to a persistent state, which usually means the hard drive, you have to have it encrypted. The good news around this is it's actually not that hard to do. You don't have to create your own encryption algorithm. Actually, hard drive encryption is usually adequate for most healthcare providers. They're fine with that. And if we're hosted on AWS, clicking the little EBS encrypted volume, that covers our needs for the most part. So don't overthink that. It's great if you have full database encryption. That's even better, but it's not really required. And you don't have to have that in order to be HIPAA compliant. Data in transit just means when you're sending it over the wire, usually this means use HTTPS. Or if you're using TCP, make sure you're securing it in some way. Data retention policies, you have to, for us, we keep it for 7 years after the life of the contract, unless they ask us to delete it. This is really more applicable to the covered entities and what they want you to do, which will be spelled out in your business associate agreement. You must have really just your standard security in place. One of the key things that it does call out, which is a little bit more prescriptive than in other places, is that username and password is not enough. You have to have another authentication mechanism. That really is not adequate in general. And then you have to perform risk assessments. You have to go through, and it doesn't have to be anything overly formal. You can just really go through and identify, okay, this is where we're storing our data. This is the risk to that data, and here's how we're mitigating that risk. That's enough. So the practical applications of meaningful use. It means, like we talked about EHRs, now everybody's got one, right? Because they had to. Legally, they had to all adopt this, which makes them the de facto backbone of the healthcare IT industry. So if you want to interact with a healthcare provider, you will in some way be interacting with their EHR at some point. The whole meaningful use criteria, that means if you're trying to touch on something that's covered by meaningful use, you have to make sure you understand what is in the meaningful use criteria. Because if you don't meet it, you're dead in the water because nobody's legally allowed to use your solution. And the last piece is kind of, this isn't officially part of HITECH. They said you had to have direct messaging capabilities. And that just means you have to be able to send a patient's chart to somebody else. The industry in general has come to the conclusion that the CCDA document is the standard that everybody's going to use. It's maintained by the HL7 organization. We'll talk about that a little bit more later if we get time. But it means Common Clinical Document Architecture. It's an XML document is what it really comes down to. Not that hard to parse and kind of create. Definitely better than the flat files that you used to have to work with. So now we get to kind of the more fun part of the talk. That was all the kind of dry history stuff. Now let's talk about what it means to ship a successful product and how you do that. So the first thing I want to point out, and this is really where the title of the talk came from, is technology is usually not the solution to the problem. Technology can enable the solution, but usually it's something deeper, and there's some sort of policy or some sort of habit in the industry that's really causing the main problem. So for instance, telemedicine. Everyone thinks, oh, the answer to telemedicine is better technology. There's really good telemedicine technology out there, and video conferencing technology, and all the things needed. It exists already, and there's a lot of things with really cool features. The real barrier is not the tech part of it. The real barrier is, number one, people are afraid to use it. There's a friction with it. Doctors don't really know how to work it into their schedule. And then the last one is probably the biggest one. Doctors don't really know how to get reimbursed for it. They don't know how to get paid for this yet. So keep that in mind. Your technology stack will probably not completely fix the solution. You just have to incrementally make things better and kind of overcome those policy problems. Ask yourself, does it need to be a standalone product, or can I build this upon something that's already kind of a standard in the healthcare industry? I can't answer that question for you. Ideally, you're going to limit your market if you're building on top of something else, but at the same time, your adoption and your growth rate at the beginning is going to be much better. Ask yourself, who's paying for your solution? Are they the person that can say yes? And you have to ask yourself, am I saving somebody money, or am I generating more revenue for them? Because if you're not doing one of those things, you might be able to get away with just saying, we're creating better clinical outcomes, but that usually doesn't move the needle a whole lot when it comes to adopting new technology. Also, replacing people, rarely a recipe for success. If we went into a sports medicine director who used to be an athletic trainer in almost all cases, and we said, hey, you can replace your entire staff of athletic trainers with virtual athletic trainers, that wouldn't be a good sale, right? Nobody would want to buy our solution at that point, because now, hey, we're firing all of our friends, right? That's just a bad idea in general. Don't try to replace people. You see this a lot in AI. They're trying to replace people with AI in healthcare, supplement people with AI. And sometimes maybe some jobs will go away, but don't make replacing people your strategy for success. The last point is your customers aren't buying your product. This is what your customers are buying. They're little cute Mario, right? You have a flower, that's your product. They're buying fire-breathing Mario. They're not buying your product, they want to be fire-breathing Mario. If your product doesn't turn them into fire-breathing Mario, it doesn't matter how pretty it is, it's a beautiful flower, it doesn't matter to them. They're not going to pay money for it. If a better flower comes along that also gives them more capabilities, they're going to buy that one. They're not buying your product, they're buying what your product can do for them. So ask yourself that question. Don't just come up with a cool idea. Ask yourself who this is helping and what it's enabling them to do. So, process for working through a new idea. So we started with our original idea, but we've gone through this process on kind of iterating new features and new directions for our company, which is why we're not just a sports medicine company, we're kind of the outreach company that we were talking about. So the first step is to talk to your potential customers until you think you've identified a pain point, right? That seems no-brainer, but it's amazing how often we just go back into our silos and we just think through these things and we try to brainstorm ideas, and then we never go out and validate them and talk to them. Actually, if you're talking to them, they're going to throw things at you. You're not going to have to rack your brain nearly as hard. So the next step is make sure you validate that pain point with more than one customer. This is one of the most crucial things you could do. I'll tell you a little story. One of our customers, they brought a pain point to us, and they said, this is costing us millions of dollars a year, and we think your solution with only a few months of work could really solve this problem for us and save us millions of dollars a year, which seems like a no-brainer for us, right? Like, yes, let's do that right now. So we started putting it in front of our other customers and said, look what we can do for you. These guys said it would save them millions of dollars a year, and all of their responses were, we have no idea what they're talking about. Well, it turns out this one customer of ours, who have been very helpful, and they had no malicious intent, but they have a different reimbursement model than almost the entirety of the country. There are 13 other providers in the entire country that get reimbursed in the same way, and they were asking us to solve that problem. So we would have had a market opportunity of 13, which, if you're a data scientist in the audience, that's not a good number. So keep that in mind. Make sure you validate with more than one. And to add to it, the program they were getting reimbursed on was going away at the end of the year. So we would have spent several months building this product, and then it would have been completely worthless at the end of the year. May have saved them several $million in the first year, but it would have been worthless for us. So validate it with multiple customers. That's the end of the story. Design the MVP. Don't build anything yet. Just design it. There are lots of things out there that allow you to do this. Envision app is a great, not to plug them. There's like balsamic mocks out there. There's lots of these things out there that allow you to build kind of the mock-up, which is much cheaper to build, and let them validate and iterate on that. So you present it to them, allow them to iterate, add comments, figure out what your final solution is. And then this is super important. Get somebody to commit to pay for it before you write a line of code. This is what we did. We had actually 6 signed customers before we actually wrote a line of code with our original virtual athletic trainer product, which put a lot of pressure on me. And as the dev resource, that wasn't my favorite way of doing it, but from a business standpoint, I would highly recommend doing that. Because otherwise, If they're not willing to put pen to paper and say, yes, we will pay for this solution, they probably don't value it as much. They might value this creative process and like that, and they're looking for a creative outlet, but they're not willing to pay for it. The value's just not there yet. And then you build. So some things to do and some things not to do when you're talking to your customers. Do let them identify the problems, but don't let them determine the solution to the problems. That we run into a lot with athletic trainers that are coming from an old piece of software that is absolutely antiquated, and they've been on it for years. So they'll find workarounds, and they'll say, okay, here's how we do it. And then they'll come over to our solution, and they can't do the workaround. And they'll say, hey, you need to add this feature so we can do this workaround. Well, they've identified the pain point, but their solution is the workaround, not addressing the original problem. So make sure you talk to them about what the root problem is of the pain point. Don't let them design the solution for you. You come up with the solution and try to take it as far back in the root chain as possible. Do get multiple perspectives. We just talked about why that's important. Make sure to charge for your product. They may call it a pilot. That's fine. You can call it a pilot. Pay us for it. We're providing value for you. Maybe your first couple customers, you might have to do a little bit of this, but long term, okay, we can roll it out and call it a pilot if that helps you with bureaucracy, but make sure you pay us for it. One of the things not to do is don't rely on the 20%. But what I mean by this is your top 20% do so much more work. These are the overachievers than the other 80%. And they're the ones that are going to be willing to talk to you because they care so much, and their valuable feedback is so valuable that you're going to want to build a product that's targeted at them. The problem is you don't make money by making superheroes slightly better superheroes. You make money by turning normal Joes into superheroes, right? So target the 80% and try to make them like the 20%. Don't build a product that only appeals to those people that are already going to go above and beyond. And don't get discouraged by negative feedback at this point. Negative feedback is a good thing at this point because you haven't built anything yet. So it's not costing you anything. All it is doing is putting guardrails on your direction that you're going through, right? It's making sure you don't go off in this direction that's not going to pay off, and you're going to waste a lot of your time. So let's talk about doctors for a second. I have to be careful what I say because I'm pretty sure they're recording this and they're going to put it on YouTube later on. But doctors are very smart, but they are not product people. They will think they're product people in most cases because they probably are smarter than you. They're smarter than me, I know that. So they think they can do your job. But just remember, they're not product people. They got into this field because they wanted to treat people. So you can't rely on them to design your product for you. And most of the time, if they do, it's going to be a product designed around their specific workflow. And it's going to be really hard to take that to the next person. Getting one in your corner is extremely valuable, though, especially at smaller providers. They're like kind of the gods of smaller providers. They can control and pull the strings and get you in everywhere. At larger healthcare providers, they still pull weight, and it's still important to get them in your corner. But most of them will still not use your product. If you're building a product targeted at doctors, good luck. It's just the 20% might use it, those overachievers, but unless you're making their life so much easier, it's ridiculous, you're going to have a really hard time getting adoption among doctors. Because they're, like I said, they're in this not because they love technology and love new tools. They're in this because they want to treat patients and then they want to move on with their life. If they didn't legally have to use EHRs, they would not use EHRs. The only reason EHR adoption was so successful is because CTOs could say, use this or you're fired because the government says so. They're not going to do that for your product, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, their staff does a lot of the work for them. They treat the patients, but almost all the administrative stuff is done by somebody else. Even a lot of times the notes are passed off to somebody else to enter. So don't necessarily design a solution only targeted at doctors. Keep their staff in mind. So building the product. Let's talk about what's required by HIPAA. All changes to PHI have to be auditable. You got to know who, what, and when made those changes, which means you have to log all login attempts as well. You have to encrypt data in transit at rest, which we talked about before. And the last step is probably the most important part of this slide, and that's don't do this at an ad hoc basis. Build this into your architecture and framework. You shouldn't have to be thinking about creating an audit trail for every time new piece of data you add. It should just be part of your framework that you automatically get this out of the box. There are products out there and platforms on the market that do this for you. We didn't do that. We built it all, rolled it all internally, because I'm really uncomfortable building my product completely on a separate platform and being beholden to them. But if you're comfortable with that and you're okay with that, that might be a good way to get rolling early on. Something that might seem counterintuitive is minimize your scope. You might think, oh, I want my solution to do everything because that's going to make people happier. The more it does, the more broader my audience is, right? Well, that might work at smaller smaller places like primary care physicians, but larger healthcare providers, it will actually fight against you actively. And the reason we've run into this a little bit because we rolled out a messaging component that really works for the model that sports medicine falls under, but it's not really a clinical messaging component that works throughout internally in the healthcare provider. But because some of the doctors are on it, and it's called messaging, we've run into the point where there are messaging. I saw Halo out there. They're one of these, and Tiger Text, or whatever it's called, Tiger Connect now is another one of them. They've spent years getting vetted by somebody that has an internal champion and said, this is our messaging solution that we're going to use internally. And the larger the scope of your product, the more of those feet you're going to step on when you try to move into a new healthcare provider. So if you can minimize your footprint and solve a smaller problem that less people are solving, you're going to have a much easier time getting penetration. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Do you need to build a standalone product, or can you build on top of something else? And the last thing that's super important is make sure to play nicely with other vendors in the space. And what do I mean by that? I mean, build with integrations in mind from the start. We have pieces of our platform that were built with this. Other pieces were not, and I really regret not building it this way now. So start with an API, ideally, and kind of the Amazon, AWS way of doing things. Only consume through the publicly available API, ideally. If you can do that, it's going to make integrations down the road a lot easier. And these are some of the formats that you can interact with EHR systems with. We talked about CCDA earlier. HL7 is a kind of a flat file format, essentially. The version 2, you'll hear about version 2 and version 3. Nobody uses version 3. You won't hear about a version 1, incidentally enough, because in what can only be described as the marketing move of the century, there was no version 1. They said, nobody's going to use it if we call it version 1. We're just going to come out with version 2, and it worked, right? It got huge adoption. It was kind of the de facto standard for a real long time. It's going away a little bit in favor of some of these other flavors, but maybe take that advice for your product. Skip version 1, just call it version 2. Whatever you do, don't call it a beta, because then nobody will use it. Keep that in mind. Fire is kind of the new version that's replacing a lot of the HL7 interfaces that you used to have. And the cool thing about Fire is it actually has OAuth authentication built in, so patients can access their own data. The downside of Fire is it's mostly pull right now. There's not a whole lot of push going on, which means if you need to write to the EHR, you can't consume these Fire interfaces for the most part. Almost all of the EHR vendors have custom APIs. The app stores are a relatively new thing, but I think it's the direction a lot of them are heading. Athena has had it for a while, and it's essentially just a marketplace, kind of similar to the iTunes App Store, but it makes it a little easier to do the integration effort because you get access to all their APIs and a resource dedicated from the EHR vendor. Epic has rolled out their App Orchard recently. We're going through that process right now. Pretty well. We can't talk about a whole lot because we're under NDA, but it's going pretty well so far. We like it. I guess that's all I can say about it. If you have more questions, talk to me in private. Maybe we can talk about it. Something else, when you're rolling it out, make sure you identify an internal champion. Because if you don't, you're going to be dead on the vine. You're going to get in there, and it's going to turn into shelfware, right? You have to have somebody that has a vested interest, not necessarily financially, because a lot of times you can't do that, but more of a emotional interest in seeing your product rolled out. And if you don't have that, you're going to have a hard time. Churn rate, like I said here, is 90% based on onboarding. Even if you have a 3-year commitment contract, if you don't onboard them right within the first 30 days, chances are you're going to lose them. It's really hard to recover from a bad onboarding experience for new clients. And then security assessments. They are Not my favorite. Has anybody in here had to fill out a security assessment from a healthcare provider before? Oh yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, those weren't enthusiastic. Yeah, I've done that. They were not fun. They're just questionnaires, essentially, which doesn't sound that bad, except they're just long and tedious, hundreds of questions long most of the time, and they're all slightly different. I would love to be able to just take a framework and copy and paste the answers, because most of them are kind of redundant in the same thing over and over again, but they're all phrased slightly differently, so you can't do that. It's really painful to do. Some things to keep in mind when you're first starting out. You won't be perfect. Be honest with your answers, especially early on, because if you're an early stage startup and you nail it across the board, you're going to raise some red flags. One of the best things you can do is use those negative things on those as your roadmap for improving your security. And that goes a long way when you say, hey, look, we didn't know we needed to do this, but we're going to fix it now. We didn't recognize this before. We're putting out a roadmap. It will be ready by the next time we talk to you. And then you follow up and do that, and it's going to give them a lot of confidence in you. You need to go through third-party penetration testing really to be HIPAA compliant. There are ways you can it's addressable, so there are ways you can kind of skirt that early on, but you really should be doing it, and it's going to help this process go a lot smoother because they're going to identify a lot of the issues before you ever have to answer the security questionnaire. They're always going to be painful, but this last point, it's just kind of the reality of the situation. If you get some big name logos on there, it's going to make this process a lot smoother because it gives the people that are reviewing your security assessment a little bit of cover. They can say, look, I may have missed this thing, but over here, did you see these guys also use this solution, right? So if you can get some big name logos on your website, it helps. That's just the reality of life. Finding customers, I'm going to breeze through this because it's not all that important. But identify your customer profile. We sell all over the map, which is difficult. We know that in order to narrow it down, they have to have a sports medicine department. That's really kind of the only qualifier that we have. If you have a sports medicine department, then we can sell to you. But that means sometimes we're selling to small offices, sometimes we're selling to orthopedic groups, sometimes we're selling to giant healthcare, that's what I'm looking for, healthcare groups, and the sales process is so different across all those. It's very difficult. Ideally, you could identify a certain size of customer and kind of the way they operate and kind of narrow it down from there. For us, sports medicine, there's a limited market for that in general, so we can't rule that many people out. If you have sports medicine, we want to talk to you. Find out who can give you a yes, and that's the person you want to talk to. Don't spend a whole lot of time with the underlings. Sometimes somebody might have a big name title like VP or director, but they still have to go back to the financial committee. Find that out early on. And this last point is probably the most important point on this slide, and that's try to avoid relying on just clinical measures as your sales tool. And I say that because when we first launched, there was a competitor we found that had very similar features. They were actually ahead of us in the game, and we thought, oh crap, they're so cool. They have all these things. Look, these things that we want to build, they already have them. And we thought, we're going to have to fight these guys tooth and nail everywhere we go. Well, it was a company that was founded by a former doctor. So his mode of operation was, hey, we have to go through a clinical trial, and we have to prove the clinical value of this product. Well, that's not really what our product does. So we didn't have to do that, right? We're not claiming anything about clinical outcomes based on our product. So we just sold our product. We sold it and said, hey, look, this is going to enable you. It's going to make your workflows better. It's going to help your outreach efforts. And they went through like a 2-year clinical trial. When we first started, I think we had like 8 customers. They had 2. 3 years later, we came across them recently. We have over 100. They have 2. So if you can avoid having to go through that whole clinical trial thing, try to do that. If obviously you're making claims about clinical outcomes, you can't avoid that, but just keep that in mind. So this is kind of a tangent that I'm going to go on here. I'm really forcing this into the talk because I just thought it was cool. Has anybody seen this before? Dreyfus model for learning? If you have, you probably know more about it than I do. I saw a talk on it, which made me an expert. So now I'm going to teach you about it. It's kind of intuitive. It's kind of the stages you go through when you're learning a new skill or topic. And you start as a novice, and when you're a novice, you're kind of handed the rules like Moses with the tablet and the 10 Commandments, right? And you just have to follow the rules. You don't really understand why. And then as you progress through the different stages of learning, you provide more context to that, right? And you can add more rules in, and you can kind of combine rules to figure out how you need to make decisions and progress forward. Skip forward to the expert stage, and I want to draw attention to two different things. Number one, it says you're transcending the reliance on rules, and you're no longer thinking about the rules, right? And secondly, it becomes an intuitive grasp of situations, so you're not thinking through deductive reasoning your way through these problems. This is the mechanic that hears a car go by, and they immediately diagnose the problem. They say, I don't even have a good example because I'd be a novice mechanic, but you get the point, right? So that's the stages of learning you go through. So this is the Dreyfus squared model. And I got this from a talk by Dan North, who used to be with ThoughtWorks. Great talk on YouTube. You should go watch it. It's Patterns of Effective Teams. But essentially a practical application of that Dreyfus model towards mentorship and learning and teaching. And the question that this is asking is, if you are a novice, who do you want teaching you? If you're like me, your immediate reaction is, I want the expert, right? I want the guy that knows everything, because I don't want to settle for the second best. I don't want, this competent or proficient guy. He's not going to see everything. I want the guy that's been in this industry for 20 years. Well, it turns out you're wrong, and I'm wrong. And what you actually want is a competent, proficient person. And it makes sense when you go back and you think about it. Go back. It makes sense when you go back and think about, I ruined the punchline there. You go back and you think about what an expert is, right? They're not thinking about the rules, and the novice only has the rules to go on. So how is the expert going to teach that novice anything of value at that point in their progression, right? This is Linus Torvald trying to teach a CS 101 class. There's lots of swearing, as Dan North says, somebody probably dies, right? And when you think about it, this is what an expert trying to teach a novice looks like, right? You draw the circles and just draw the owl, right? Because they're not thinking about the rules. They don't go through these steps anymore. They just draw the owl because they're an expert artist, right? Well, that's not all that helpful for the novice. What you actually want is somebody that's competent or proficient. You want somebody that's just a few steps ahead of you in the process and is really kind of still figuring out the rules themselves. Luckily for you all, that's where I fall squarely in. I'm not an expert. I think there are probably at least 20 people in the room that know more than me. But if you are a novice and a beginner and you're starting your own startup, one thing I'm going to say, and the reason I brought this up, is because the most valuable thing you can find is somebody that's just a few steps ahead of you in the process, and lean on them. Try to foster those relationships. I've been lucky enough to find a couple guys that were just a few steps ahead of me in this whole healthcare startup world that were willing to kind of answer my questions when I need them. I could take them out to lunch, grab coffee with them, and that's been more valuable than any book, any article, any talk I've gone to. So that's the thing I would recommend more than anything. And I will offer myself up there. I'm here, sacrificial lamb style. That makes it sound like I'm really not going to enjoy our lunch. But if you would like to grab lunch and talk about this, I'm more than happy to sit down and kind of talk where you are in the process and where you're going. So that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions. Anybody?
When you talked about compliance in AWS, you said it was as simple as just encrypting that disk within AWS. Is there a specific type of account you need to be HIPAA compliant with AWS for that, or is it really Azure?
Yeah, so it's actually gotten a lot easier to be HIPAA compliant on AWS. It used to be very expensive because you had to run dedicated instances for everything. And when you run a dedicated instance of a piece of hardware, in a region, it's per region a $2,000 immediate fee, no matter how small the hardware is. So, when you're starting out, that gets super expensive. Suddenly, your baseline before you actually add any hardware is 24 grand a year, and that's only if you're in a single region. So recently, they've actually changed that, and now you can use shared tenancy models and still remain compliant. Now, there are certain services in AWS that you can't use. The chatbots. Or one of their Lex service, you actually can't use the Lex service. It's not one of the covered clients, which is kind of annoying because I'd like to use that for something on our project, but we can't. We got to kind of find a different solution for that. So, any other questions? I don't know if there are any questions on Slack or anything, but I don't have it. Yeah.
You kind of talked at the last second, so I apologize if you already answered this, but what inspired you to start Focus?
Well, for us, it was really, we were trying to stay in the space that we knew, and this was kind of tangential to that. We really, when we first started the initial product, we wanted to help kids in youth sports, and we wanted to help them. Concussion was a major problem, and my two co-founders had kids that played youth sports, and we really wanted to kind of help with that care, and really, we didn't expect it to go the direction that it did, and kind of finding out that the healthcare providers really want to be involved in that process, and they're probably the most important part of that. In retrospect, it makes perfect sense. You're talking about the health of youth athletes. The healthcare provider should have been involved, but that's kind of where we started out. So. Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of any players that are moving, with a number of states moving towards direct primary care and right to shop and some more market-based things in the healthcare space? Do you know of anybody who's supporting those moves?
From a vendor standpoint?
Yeah.
I don't. I haven't heard anything about that. I'm sure it's a space that is ripe for innovation. I will say, though, I get really hesitant when people talk about building startups around some sort of policy shift. And you see that actually with the reimbursement model in orthopedics, where there was a policy shift to where everything was about value-based care, and it was kind of reimbursement based on readmissions and all this kind of stuff. And that lasted for a little while, but it's starting to shift away from that now. So if you're building your whole business model around a certain policy, the next administration could come in and completely take your legs out from under you on that one. I'm not saying it's not worth doing, but you're placing a bet when you do that this is the direction it's happening long term. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's. Let me pontificate on that for another hour. I think there are certain places where we're going to see a lot of innovation. I do think the whole idea of remote medicine and telemedicine is really going to take off. And at some point, once we figured out the reimbursement model, I think you're going to see a lot more of that. It's a really hot topic. If you go to any of the conferences, that's what they're all talking about, is how do we make this a legitimate piece of the puzzle. And I think we're just really on the tail end of the EHR adoption. And I think we're going to see a lot of, as we figure out, okay, now everybody's electronic, now everybody's digitized, what's next? What kind of power do we have with this? And I like to say that all the AI and the machine learning stuff is going to lead to this boom in improved care. I'm just not sure that that's going to be the biggest change. I think people will still be at the center of that whole process. I do think you'll have, we talk about the right to shop and all that. I think you'll have a lot easier time transitioning from one provider to the other and finding providers maybe in a different state or a different part of the country that are really more specialized in your needs. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and it's going to become a much smoother process.
You mentioned you work with providers directly or with schools that have providers.
Yeah.
Do you also kind of foresee an ability to go direct to consumer?
We always bring that up. Honestly, there's two sides to that. Number one, we don't want to compete with our current customers, so we don't want to be taking their markets away from them. But even with that said, there's lots of markets where there just is no healthcare provider available. The biggest problem with that is it's a scaling issue. In each state, there are lots of high schools that don't have athletic trainers available to them, and we really would love to be able to provide that resource to them. The problem is us hiring a resource to do that. We're just not in a state where that makes sense from a financial standpoint to do that. We've talked about partnering with our current providers to kind of offer that as a service for even kind of those remote people where there may not be as much financial incentive for them. But that gets tricky. But it's really a matter of doing it right. And that's difficult for us to do right now because we're a software company. That's kind of a different play for us. Suddenly we're providing the healthcare if we go direct to consumer like that. So, anybody else? Okay, guys. Well, I'm here to talk. I'll be around in the hallways, so definitely talk to me. And like I said, there's my information. Reach out, send an email if you'd like to grab lunch or coffee and just kind of talk about things. Happy to do it. So, thanks.